Hey guys, welcome to episode 12 of Directed by Steven Spielberg. Today's film marks the first time in Spielberg's career that he directed multiple films in 1 year. It also marks the end of the 80s portion of his career, which produced some of the best films in history. Today's film is actually one of the few Spielberg films I had never heard of when I was researching his filmography prior to starting this series. And that film is Always, a romantic fantasy starring Richard Dreyfuss, Holly Hunter, and John Goodman. I wasn't sure what to expect with this film at all going into it, but the genre description of romantic fantasy definitely had me intrigued. So what did I think of the film? Let's find out. Always is a romantic drama that blends elements of fantasy with a poignant love story. The film follows Pete Sandage, played by Richard Dreyfuss, a fearless aerial firefighter known for his daring maneuvers and love of flying. His girlfriend, Dorinda Durston, and best friend Al Yaki constantly worry about his reckless attitude towards his dangerous job. Tragically, Pete dies in a heroic act, saving Al during a wildfire. In the afterlife, Pete meets an angel named Hap, played by Audrey Hepburn, who guides him through his new existence. Pete is tasked with returning to Earth as a guardian angel to inspire and mentor a young pilot, Ted Baker. However, Pete's ethereal presence complicates things as he watches Ted fall in love with Dorinda, who is struggling to move on from Pete's death. Throughout the film, Pete learns to let go of his past and embrace his new role, finding peace and helping Dorinda find happiness again. The film concludes with Pete successfully guiding Dorinda into Ted's arms and having completed his angelic duties. The end. This was a strange one. The premise of this film had me intrigued going in, but I can't say that the end result quite lived up to the promise. The first 40 minutes had me feeling simultaneously intrigued and perplexed. The intrigue came from solid character development that built up the relationship between Pete and Dorinda really well, where you could truly feel their love for one another and easily become invested in the complexities of their relationship. But there were scenes that felt a little off, namely the extended dance sequence. After Pete successfully lands his dead stick plane at the beginning, a celebration of sorts takes place as Pete and Dorinda begin to dance, before she takes turns dancing with all the other men there. It's a bit weird and, dare I say, creepy, but I get that it's meant to emphasize how special and desirable she is, which ultimately is meant to make us wish even more that Pete would not go on the mission that would lead to his demise. It just felt a little weird and the scene seemed to go on forever. That said, I would actually say that the first 40 minutes leading up to Pete's death was actually my favorite portion of the film, which is ironic considering that Pete's death acts as the catalyst for the film's actual plot. The reason being that the emotional resonance of Pete's angelic conundrum doesn't quite live up to its potential. I think the reason for this is that with Pete's death, we realize that the peak of their relationship has already been reached and any attempts at reigniting any other romance could never compare, thus diminishing our interest. The main focus, however, is on the theme of letting go. It's the timeless dilemma of letting go of something you long for but can no longer have. In Always, you have the unique dilemma of a woman mourning the death of her lover whilst the man must move on to the afterlife. The angel, Hap, tasks Pete with helping a young pilot hone his skills. The only problem for Pete is that it's the same young pilot, Ted, from the beginning of the film who has a crush on Dorinda. And so as a byproduct of helping Ted become a pilot means also helping him fall in love with Dorinda, a pill that is initially too bitter for Pete to swallow. Therein lies the most interesting aspect of the film. We're forced as an audience to ask ourselves the question, if we could help our loved one fall in love again from beyond the grave, would we do so? Considering the story and subject matter are not typically Spielbergian, the film actually exhibits many of the classic film techniques that have become synonymous with his films. Starting off, the Spielberg lights are off the charts. Almost every scene that takes place in a closed room has a saturated light source beaming through the surrounding windows. I think it's used specifically well to create a sort of dreamy atmosphere that complements the afterlife themes of the film. Hell, even the poster has Spielberg lights. The opening shot of the film is a fantastic long take of two men peacefully fishing before an aircraft descends in the background, heading straight for them. It's a striking image that instantly grabs your attention. There's also an extended tracking shot through a field as Hap explains the afterlife to Pete. Tracking shots can be extremely effective towards holding your attention in a scene, and I think Spielberg trusts his audience to follow along with the dialogue and immerse in the moment. The foreground-background technique is also utilized for dramatic effect, but there's another Spielbergian trait that I have yet to mention so far in this series, and that is what I refer to as object framing. It's a trend I've noticed where Spielberg frames his subject matter using a nearby object. You can see it also used here in Always, in one shot when Pete is talking with Al, and another when the back of a bartender's head separates Pete and Ted within the shot. The purpose of such framing is to simply point your eyes in a particular direction. One thing I will credit Spielberg with regarding this film is that it's his first venture into the theme of romance. And I have to say that he develops quite a deep relationship here, managing to pack in a thorough love story between Pete and Dorinda into the first 40 minutes of the film. In fact, looking ahead at Spielberg's entire filmography, I dare say that Always might be Spielberg's most romantic film in his entire career, which highlights this specific genre as perhaps his most lacking. I mentioned earlier how the first 40 minutes of this film had me simultaneously intrigued and perplexed. Well, the remainder of the film was like a constant test to see if it could tug on my heartstrings. And my overall feelings on this film could be perfectly summarized by saying that the film comes very close on many occasions to being genuinely moving, but just doesn't quite get there. My best explanation for this is, as I said earlier, the relationship between Pete and Dorinda is much easier to invest in than Ted and Dorinda's, for the simple fact that their chemistry didn't feel as pure as the former's. Performance-wise, all of the main cast delivers. Richard Dreyfuss brings his usual wit to his role as Pete, whilst also bringing gravitas to the more emotional moments. This was Dreyfuss's third outing with Spielberg, joining an exclusive club of actors to star in 3 or more Spielberg films. Holly Hunter is great as Dorinda, making it easy for us as the audience to sympathize with her loss. John Goodman plays a typical goofball as Al and acts as the comedic relief for the film. And I thought Audrey Hepburn as the angel Hap in her last ever film role was perfectly cast and brought a lot of grace to her cameo. Technically speaking, the film is rock solid and can't be faulted from a visual standpoint. The plane sequences are actually quite impressive and make for some truly suspenseful moments. With that said, I still didn't quite connect to the emotional core of the film, at least from the point where the actual story starts. I wanted to feel more when Pete watches Dorinda run into Ted's arms as he finally lets her go, but I just didn't. It's interesting, however, that the final shot is reminiscent of Close Encounters of the Third Kind, where you have a Richard Dreyfuss character standing on a tarmac, looking back at his friends and smiling before walking off into the great unknown. So that concludes episode 12 of Directed by Steven Spielberg. I'm ultimately glad I finally got to watch Always, because I do think it is a solid film, even if it didn't quite hit the levels that I hoped it would. It was nice, however, to see Spielberg try his hand at romance, and I think he definitely brought a lot of his directorial flair to the genre. Overall, I give Always a 6.5 out of 10, placing it equal with the Sugarland Express, but I do think it is slightly better than the Sugarland Express, and so I will place it in 10th place, right below Close Encounters of the Third Kind. So that concludes today's episode, and I hope you all very much enjoyed it. With 80s Spielberg coming to a close, the next episode steps into the 90s with the return to the adventure genre. And that is the 1991 fantasy adventure film Hook, starring Robin Williams and Dustin Hoffman. I have never seen Hook before, so I am very much looking forward to checking it out. Until then, I thank you all very much for watching, and we'll talk to you next time. Bye.